This video is about the savings gap and the Harrod-Domar model. You'll find it in Theme 4, 4.3.2, Factors Influencing Growth and Development. The Harrod-Domar model is a theory about economic growth. According to this theory, a country's economic growth rate is a function of two factors. The first of these factors is the level of saving, and the second factor is the productivity of capital. Some background first. Developing countries are poor, low material standards of living. In the long run, to consume more goods, developing countries must produce more. To do that, they've got to achieve economic growth. And to achieve this growth, investment is typically needed. The Harrod-Domar model was developed by two Keynesian economists in the late 1940s. Economic growth can be defined as an increase in the potential output of an economy. Potential output is the maximum that an economy can produce if it uses all of its factors of production efficiently. To cause growth in potential output, it's necessary to sacrifice some consumption today. Resources which could have been used to make consumer goods must be diverted instead to enhancing the stock of resources available for future production. Investment in the future capacity of the economy therefore carries the opportunity cost of current consumption forgone. This is what we mean by the phrase jam today or more jam tomorrow. To have more jam tomorrow, you must sacrifice some consumption, some jam today. The implications of this are particularly cruel for developing nations. To create growth, extra investment will be needed. However, in order to produce extra capital goods, factors of production will have to be moved out of producing consumer goods. In a developing country context, this will entail sacrificing consumption of basic necessities. Before things can get better then, almost certainly things will get worse in the short run. Saving is not the same as investment. Saving is undertaken by households. It's the act of postponing consumption. Investment, on the other hand, is something that firms do. It's capital expenditure. That said, there is an indirect link between the levels of saving and investment within an economy. Let's explore this connection in some more detail. So, capital goods, as we know, are very expensive. Therefore, many firms are forced to take out bank loans to pay for their capital expenditure. Commercial banks get their money from households who save. If saving levels are very low, banks will be starved of the loanable funds that they need to finance business loans to entrepreneurs who would like to borrow to buy capital equipment. In many developing countries, households are just too poor to save. As a consequence, in developing countries, investment tends to be low because there's a savings gap. Loanable funds are in short supply, and if banks haven't got any money in their vaults to lend out, entrepreneurs won't be able to get their hands on loans, and without the loans, they won't be able to buy the capital. So investment is constrained by a lack of loanable funds. It's as simple as that. Let's look at the Harrod-Domar equation. According to the equation, a country's economic growth rate is equal to S over Y, where S is the savings ratio and K is the capital output ratio. Let's dig into this so that you understand how this formula works and what these letters mean. So, from the beginning, according to the Harrod-Domar model, economic growth is a function of the quantity and quality of the investment undertaken by a country. The savings ratio is also called the average propensity to save. It is the proportion of GDP that's saved. In China, the savings ratio is over 40%. That means that on average, households in China save 40% of their incomes. The savings ratio in Britain is less than 10%. That's because we're a nation of consumption addicts. We have a very high time preference. We want it all now. We're not prepared to save. Anyway, the more households save, the more loanable funds banks have available. If banks have more loanable funds available, they'll be able to make more loans to entrepreneurs. That means that entrepreneurs will have more money available to purchase capital. So if entrepreneurs are purchasing more capital, by definition, that implies a higher level of investment. So what determines the quantity of saving taking place within an economy? Well, all sorts of cultural factors, and I guess the other big variable is the interest rate. If the interest rate is very low, the financial incentive to save will be quite weak. The quantity of saving taking place within an economy determines the quantity of investment taking place. The capital output ratio, in contrast, is an indicator of the quality of investment taking place. This is important. A country that is saving a high proportion of its income won't achieve good rates of growth if they're investing in the wrong type of capital projects. More precisely, the capital output ratio measures the number of units of capital required to produce an extra unit of output. A capital output ratio of 4 indicates that 4 more units of capital are needed to produce every extra unit of GDP. A capital output ratio of 3 is better because it implies that to produce an extra unit of output, only 3 rather than 4 extra units of capital are needed. So then, low capital output ratios are preferable because fewer units of capital are needed to produce every additional unit of GDP. Creating economic growth. The Harrod-Domar model implies that there are 2 sources of growth. One is an increase in saving as a proportion of national income. The other is a lowering of the capital output ratio. A lower capital output ratio might come about through technological advances that increase the productivity of capital goods. Let's do some very easy maths using the Harrod-Domar formula to see how this works. As you know, according to the Harrod-Domar model, a country's GDP growth is a function of its savings ratio, S, and its capital output ratio, K. So one more time, economic growth is equal to S over K, where S is equal to the APS or savings ratio and K is equal to the capital output ratio. So let's take a hypothetical country. The people of this country currently save 4% of their incomes. Their savings will go straight into the banks, who will then lend it out again to entrepreneurs who want to invest. A savings ratio of 4% implies that capital spending will also equal 4% in this country. How much extra economic growth will this extra investment create? The answer will depend on the capital output ratio. My figure assumes that the capital output ratio is 4. This indicates that 4 more units of capital are needed to create every extra unit of output. Therefore, a 4% increase in investment will only generate 1% more output, an economic growth rate of just 1%. For the mathematically minded, look back at the formula. Growth is equal to S over K. The value of S is 4. The value of K is also 4. 4 over 4 is 1. If this country can persuade its people to sacrifice some more of their consumption and save maybe 20% of its income rather than 4%, the rate of economic growth will increase to 5%. Let's look at the figures there. To produce an extra unit of output, 4 more units of capital are needed, but now the country is saving 20% of its GDP. So the country is investing 20% of its GDP every year. 20 divided by 4 is 5. This country will achieve a 5% rate of economic growth. So the conclusion to draw at this point is that one way of creating a faster rate of economic growth is to invest more. But to do that, countries will need to save more, which in turn means that households have to postpone more of their current consumption, which means a lower material standard of living. So, yep, this is one way in which you can achieve a faster rate of economic growth. Get households to save more. More money will go to the banks in loanable funds. They can make more loans to entrepreneurs. You can get investment up, and if there's more capital expenditure, ceteris paribus, there will be more output. The magnitude of that increase in output will all depend on the productivity of capital. It will depend on the value of K, the capital output ratio. The other way to create a faster rate of economic growth is to reduce the capital output ratio. Effectively, this means improving the quality of your investment decision making, so that each unit of output requires fewer capital inputs to make it happen. So let's take an example of some numbers that would illustrate this effect. So we're going to take a developing country that currently saves 20% of its GDP. The capital output ratio is 4, so it takes 4 units of capital to produce an extra unit of GDP. If we're saving 20% of GDP, we're also investing 20% of GDP. The capital stock is growing at a rate of 20%. 20 divided by 4 gives us a 5% rate of economic growth. So let's see what can happen if we can manage to reduce the capital output ratio to 2. So in this case, what's happened is that we're now investing in more sensible capital projects. We're now creating a situation where we only need 2 extra units of capital to produce an extra unit of GDP. So the savings ratio is 20%. We're investing 20% of GDP. The capital output ratio of 2 suggests a 10% rate of economic growth. 20 divided by 2 is equal to 10. So what we've got here is a doubling in the rate of economic growth without the need for households to save any more or consume any less. So this is a much better way of creating a faster rate of economic growth than asking people in already very poor countries to sacrifice still more of their already pitifully low levels of consumption. A savings gap exists when a country's savings ratio is not high enough to achieve the rate of economic growth that a country would like to achieve. Let's take an example. Suppose that the government of Azerbaijan wants to achieve economic growth of 10% a year. Assuming a capital output ratio of 3, a savings ratio of 30% would be needed to hit this growth target. But let's suppose that due to low incomes, households in Azerbaijan currently save just 10% of their incomes. To recap, Azerbaijan needs a savings ratio of 30% to hit their growth target, but they're only managing 10%. These figures imply a 20% savings gap. So, one more time, a savings gap exists when a country isn't saving enough to achieve the rate of economic growth that it would like to achieve. So, what can countries do about savings gaps? Well, the first thing that they could do is take a loan from the World Bank. The World Bank specialises in making loans to developing countries. World Bank loans are supposed to be used to finance capital expenditure. In effect, World Bank loans help developing countries to overcome savings gaps. They enable poor countries to borrow and invest without having to sacrifice current consumption. So it's a way of creating the growth that we would all like to see without having to ask people in very poor countries to save even more of their pitifully small incomes. Inward foreign direct investment, FDI, can also be used to fill a domestic savings gap. BMW's factory in Oxford was built using German savings. British households didn't have to sacrifice any of their current consumption to get the factory built. So this is another tactic that developing countries could use. They might be struggling with a savings gap, so rather than asking their own population to save more, which is going to be really painful because they don't earn very much money and their consumption is already very low, the solution is that you court foreign direct investment from a multinational, a transnational corporation, and they'll do the expensive job of building factories and purchasing robots for you. Another solution is microfinance. In today's globalized world, foreign banks specializing in small-scale microfinance business loans can provide the loanable funds needed to set up infant manufacturing firms in the developing world. Occasionally, charities might use their donors' money constructively to finance capital expenditure in developing countries. So this is another way in which a country might try to fill a savings gap. So what could possibly go wrong? Let's look at some of the drawbacks of accepting external finance as a way of filling a domestic savings gap. In his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins gives many examples of developing countries that have racked up debt because they chose to borrow money from abroad to fill a domestic savings gap. So what could go wrong? The first problem is corruption. A developing country will struggle to repay a World Bank loan if the loan's been used by a corrupt leader to finance consumption of imported luxuries for their own personal consumption. Second, even if politicians are decent and honest, yes, and that is a huge assumption, how likely is it that politicians will be able to choose which investment projects they should be investing in? The government in Nepal borrowed millions to build a runway that was practically useless because it was too short. It could only accommodate very small aircraft. It was a proverbial white elephant. To maximise a country's growth prospects, the state should aim to channel investment into industries that have low capital output ratios. That would be the theory of accepting a World Bank loan. However, are state central planners really capable of identifying projects that have a low capital output ratio? If the rates of growth generated from a World Bank loan are low, the government will struggle to generate the extra tax incomes needed to pay the interest on the money that they've borrowed. This is how developing countries get into debt. In practice, what typically happens is that the poor old citizens of the badly governed developing country are left with the bill to pay. And that bill's paid through having to undertake fiscal austerity. So tax rates go up and public services are cut. Therefore, in conclusion, it's not a given that external finance that's used to fill a savings gap generates economic development. It may well be that the ordinary people of the developing country end up with even less disposable income because they're being whacked with tax, and they're getting even less back in terms of public services. You know, the taxes that they're paying are flowing straight out of the country in interest payments to the World Bank or to microfinance providers. So it's important when you look at this topic to take a balanced perspective.